All right, we've got Misbah Haque on the podcast. Misbah is himself a podcaster. He runs a show called the Airborne Mind, which is really, really good, and I think that you should check it out because you'll probably like it. A few good episodes that I particularly enjoyed were with James Fitzgerald from OPEX. He's been on twice. Marcus Philly has been on dozens and dozens of times, seemingly, discussing functional bodybuilding, all that good stuff. And CTP, who's doing content creation for Training Think Tank, and in the past was with Barbell Shrugged, had actually, I think, one of the best episodes really talking about a lot of the behind the scenes work with podcasting and all that good stuff. So head on over to the airbornemind.com to see more about that. But in this episode, we get into a lot of stuff about the process for podcasting, finding the story and guests, coming up with questions, researching, all that really interesting, at least to me, nitty gritty behind the scenes stuff that really results in delivering great shows. But beyond that, Misbah himself has a pretty ridiculous story. This guy started off in Philadelphia with a microphone and was terrified to create content and thought everyone would laugh at him and judge him and all that typical self-defeating stuff. But in a few years, just from his podcast and creating stuff online and meeting some people and being in the right place at the right time, he's gone from being on his own and kind of having the dream of being a coach to now moving out to California after doing an internship at CrossFit Invictus. And he works with Marcus Philly now as an individualized coach for Revival Strength. So pretty amazing trajectory in terms of what can happen if you, I mean, the phrase is almost cliche at this point, put yourself out there. But Misbah has done a great job of it. So check this out to see how he gets it done. All right, this is Todd Neef, and I'm here with Misbah Haque, who is a podcaster. He has a show called the Airborne Mind, which is great. Misbah, how many episodes have you done so far?
Wow, we are officially at 67 episodes, and then a couple that are sitting in the bank. So hopefully over 70 at this point.
Yeah, and that's a good way to do it. Kind of stockpile some content and make the people beg until you release it, right?
Absolutely, got to put teasers out there.
Yeah, exactly. So Misbah has a podcast that I've listened to for a while now. I think actually the first episode I listened to was one with Jason on it, because I've also interviewed Jason and ended up coming across it. And I was like, oh, cool. Here's another guy who has some guests who I like, so I'm going to check this out. And Jason actually facilitated the connection between us, and here we are having a chat, two podcasters passing like trains in the night. And what I'd like to start with, because what I think is really interesting, kind of going back and digging into some of your older episodes, is sort of your trajectory, not just as a podcaster, but as a person, where when you first started the show, you were a guy in, I believe, Philadelphia, interviewing some CrossFit Games athletes, and since then you've done a lot of stuff in a little over a year. Give us that arc. Explain to us what you've done.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be on the other side. This is a bit foreign to me, but forgive me, if I sound a little nervous. But really, my fitness journey began in Philadelphia. That's where I grew up, is the suburbs of Philly. And, I started very early on in the personal training game, got into the group fitness game where I was teaching spinning, yoga, boot camps, all that type of stuff. Eventually, I stumbled upon CrossFit, and that's kind of what I stuck to for quite a few years, teaching group fitness in that setting. And then once I had this back injury, which really kind of, awakened what my purpose in fitness was, which was really health and longevity. I was on this, it was the catalyst for me to learn all that I could about movement. And I just became very, very curious as to how to prevent that similar injury from happening in other people and how to help them, live happier and more fulfilling lives while moving and preventing injury. And then I got into Olympic weightlifting for a couple years. I competed in that. And then the same thing kind of happened there. Was I burned out a little bit and had to realize, I'm getting a little bit injured. This is not really why I got into this. My purpose was really to just explore different types of movement. And to me, I view it as kind of art. And, podcasting is something that is the perfect medium for me to kind of express my creativity. I had started out blogging a little bit and I got the hang of writing. That was going kind of well, but it still didn't feel as fulfilling as podcasting did when I first started. And I would just imagine myself being a host when I would listen to other podcasts that I enjoyed. And I was like, you know what? I think I can do this. And something held me back, for quite some time. I was like, maybe in like 3 to 5 years when I have a little bit of following on the blog or more people want to listen, then I'll jump into it. And then shortly thereafter, like from the moment I had that thought to like 3 weeks ahead of time, I had gotten my first 3 guests, got the equipment I needed, got these episodes recorded, and just jumped right into it. It was much harder than I had expected. I was really nervous, and you can kind of listen to that from episode 1 all the way to now. You're right. There is this trajectory where the audience is able to pick up on some of the things that I'm interested in, some of the things that I'm learning about, and then my development in communication. Communication is something that I hold very, very dear to me. It's a lifelong obsession of mine that as early as I can remember, since I was like 10, 12 years old, I have been consciously trying to improve my communication. And so doing a podcast was a big leap for me because, even though I may come off as sounding maybe confident or good with my words, it's like inside, I do feel awkward at times, and I stumble over my words just like anybody. And so that's been a work in progress, just kind of refining the craft over time. And then eventually, the podcast, it created opportunities for me. It created connections with different people in the fitness industry. And I decided to venture out into San Diego to do a coaching internship at Invictus. And what a leap that was, because I didn't really know what was going to happen, what was going to come of it. It was almost like starting over, because I had become kind of well known in the area that I was. But here I was kind of going into what I considered the next level and really just learning from everybody there. And I was there for, 2.5 months. During that time, I had met up with Marcus Philly, who, we hit it off really well, when he has been on the show. And now I'm actually here at Revival Strength. I've been a coach here for a couple months. And that's kind of the trajectory so far.
Sure. Well, so let me push on a few of those points, because I think that, you're saying like, yeah, this is great. I started blogging and then I had an internship at Invictus, which I think to a lot of people, they're like, cool, I would like to have an internship at Invictus. How do I go from writing a few blogs and being a coach in Philadelphia to I'm packing my bags to go to San Diego? I mean, that's a pretty big jump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In terms of being able to connect with these different people who I admired in the fitness industry, I was doing that before the podcast came out anyways. Like I had gotten advice from, people like Mike Cazure, D Cazue, people that I had admired, Jason even being one of them. He's given me a lot of great advice. And I realized like I could do that, and I could share that with people. And that's one of the other reasons that sparked the idea of a podcast for me. So the connecting part really, was something that was natural to me. But in terms of, going from a couple blog posts to taking the leap and going to Invictus, like that was a period of a good, 1.5 years. And I know that sounds like a short amount of time, but in my world, I'm very impatient. And it felt like 3 years from the moment that I had started all the way to, me deciding to take the leap and go to San Diego. I've always been one to kind of, things that scare me. I like to kind of jump right into it and really see what happens. That was, though, my first moment really where I had no expectations, no idea like what was going to come of that. I didn't know if I would end up working at Invictus. I didn't know what the experience would be like. Like it was just a pure gut instinct that I needed to do it. And so, I kind of ran with it.
Sure. So basically what you're saying is that you kind of used the podcast as a devious master plan to enable you to connect with fitness influencers in a way where you could kind of Trojan horse them and be like, surprise, now you know me. Now you have to help me with stuff.
In a way, dude, in a way. I mean, a lot of people, when they think of podcasting and they ask like, oh, how do you monetize this thing? Right. It's like that's the wrong question. You don't want to be thinking about how you can monetize a podcast, because really what the podcast did was it gave me an opportunity to kind of show my set of skills to different people in the industry. And, with some people, I really hit it off and that relationship continued. And with others, it didn't. It was like great having them on the show and we connected. But it's not, certain opportunities didn't come out of that. And I wasn't like going around looking for all these opportunities or had this like chess game I was playing in my head. It really was, very natural with the people that happened with, with someone like Jason or Marcus. Like I got along with them really well. And, I kind of asked them for advice while also trying to provide value. But yeah, that's really, the podcast has been a platform where I can give value to people, but also create opportunities for myself. Like the internship came out of me doing the podcast and having this contact with CJ, right? And then months later, I had reached out and asked him if he had any opportunities available, and he hooked me up with, the director who was in charge of that, and then I kind of went through that whole process there. So it's not like these opportunities just come at you like you don't like it's easier. It just happens for you. It's like it helps facilitate it just a little bit, but you still got to kind of show your skills and do a majority of the work.
Sure. I mean, I think that also, a lot of these folks who are quote unquote influencers get so many just stupid questions all the time from people that are very lazy or not thought out or are very tactical and surface level. I mean, kind of like you just said, where people are like, how do I make money from a podcast? And you're like, well, okay, hold on. Like, yeah, maybe there's an answer to that, but we're nowhere near talking about that right now. But I think that anyone in that position is going to really value being asked intelligent, thoughtful questions. So then they're willing to sort of, like CJ did, sort of co-sign your application to Invictus and say, hey, listen, like I had a conversation with this guy. He's asking the right questions. He's on the right path. And that someone like that is then willing to give their cosign to someone who they see as, being interested in taking action rather than just being like, oh, I'm a random person who's going to milk you for as much value as I can get out of you and ask you dumb questions that if I did like a single Google search, I could find the answer to.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you there. The best way to learn is or showing somebody that you're learning from them is by, asking a good question, but then also demonstrating that you've heard the answer, right? And the way that happens with a lot of these people is like, I'm not, the people that have been on the podcast, I'm not talking to all of them every single day, right? But I do check in with them every once in a while. And it's like, if I do ask them for some type of advice, I do something with that, right? Like I have to put that into action and execute on it. And when I check back in a couple months later, for that person to hear the progress that has kind of happened or how it worked for me, how I applied it, it's fulfilling on their end, right? It's fulfilling for them to be like, wow, he actually did something with what I said. Because you're right, there's a lot of people who ask a lot of questions, but at the same time, maybe aren't putting it into action or aren't showing you that they've kind of heard what you're trying to say. But if you can do that, I mean, I feel like it's an innate, human thing for us to want to learn, want to teach, and want to share what we know. So that's kind of, the framework that I've used to, get advice and then act on it as well.
Sure. So you're basically saying that you'll take these questions that you have, you'll ask for advice, you'll implement the advice, and then you'll sort of circle back and say, hey, listen, like, remember when you told me XYZ about my podcast or ABC about my program design or whatever, like, here's what I did, here's what happened, here's how it worked. Like, thanks for your help. Is that kind of the framework that you're using?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm sure depending on the situation or the questions, like it might be a little bit different, but that's the general idea. Yeah. I'll give you an example. Mike Cashew, and it was Brian McKenzie, I believe. I was really having this like personal struggle before I had left for San Diego, where I didn't know if it was what I wanted to do. There was so much uncertainty, so much fear. It was totally out of my comfort zone. But at the same time, like I told you, that gut feeling of this is the next right move. This is kind of what I need to do. I had reached out to them with some of my thoughts and some of, what I was thinking. And they had given me kind of their input, and they didn't realize it at the time, but it was really profound to me, right? Like their words were very encouraging for me. And because of that, I was pushed to take that next step and take the leap and look at what's kind of manifested from that, So me circling back to them now, like I just talked to Adi Kaji on a podcast yesterday, and, I was just telling her, like, how crazy is it, that you were giving me this advice that to you, it wasn't a big deal in your head, but it meant a lot to me. And because of that, it led me down this trajectory of action that has kind of evolved into something I'd never expected.
Sure. Yeah. And you also mentioned basically, keeping in touch with these people who some would consider influencers, which, I think that for a lot of people, it's hard to keep in touch, right? Number one, it's hard to keep it top of mind. Like, oh, okay, well, I should make sure in your case, check in with the D and sort of let her know how things are going. Or I should just, check in with Mike and maybe shoot him an article or something, right? It's kind of like, number one, you have to organize it. And number two, it can feel a little bit uncomfortable if you don't feel like you have anything to necessarily say or update. Cause, I think everyone gets the sort of blast emails from a gym they went to once. It's like, we wish happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. And you're like, all right, delete, whatever, who cares, right? You don't want to just be like a noisy person like that. So how do you think about that concept of keeping in touch?
I could probably do a much better job than I am now with keeping in touch. It's definitely not, my strongest characteristic, but it's like, I think about these people kind of all the time. And, every couple months or so, I will reach out, or if I think of something that they would find interesting, I'll reach out and pass it along. But I want to kind of circle back to what you said, where, not being like an email blast or being noisy, right? Because it's so easy to pick up on that. Right? Like when you read an email, you can tell if like, was this copy and pasted and sent to like 15 other people, or did this person put some time and thought into what they were actually writing to me? So you got to keep that in mind. The other thing is like, when you reach out to someone who's busy, who's probably getting hundreds of emails a day or a week, whatever, it's like, it's hard for them to keep up. You want to make it easy for them to answer you and respond. If you're asking 3, 4, 5 different questions that are super deep that would take someone like 30 minutes to respond to you, chances are you may or may not, you might not get a response to it, or that person's going to feel overwhelmed on the other end, and you're not going to get what you want out of it. So you have to keep the other person in mind, and always kind of give the benefit of the doubt, and don't hold any grudges like, oh, this person never responded to me. It's like, we're all busy, could have totally missed it. And then last rule is just follow up.
Yeah, sure. So when you first started the podcast, you had some pretty impressive guests on pretty much right away. I think one of your first episodes was with Noah Olson and then Ben Smith right after that. And you kind of mentioned that you were sort of toying around with this idea of, should I do this podcast? Should I not do it? What did that process of actually starting and reaching out to guests look like for you, initially sort of starting from zero of like, I have an idea, now I'm going to execute?
Well, I was definitely very motivated, very inspired initially, because it was like, whoa, I'm doing this. Like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to figure out how to do this thing. And when it came to reaching out, you're right. I had 0 listeners at the time. I wasn't somebody who had I wasn't an elite athlete or coach in the industry already with this reputation. So really, I expressed my genuine interest for why I wanted to have these guests on the show. Like, what about their work resonated with me? What have I done with it? That part is really key. That was important for me when I was reaching out to each one of these people. And really, it was this genuine expression that like, look, I I don't have 100,000, 200,000 million listeners right now, but I'm committed to this craft, and I'm going to do everything I can to help support you and your message, not just now, but as we grow. And I really meant that, because at that time I was like, I don't have much to offer you aside from asking really good questions and making sure that you enjoy the conversation that we have together. But as we do grow, and if you have a message that I can help support in any way, like I'm always here to kind of do that. And so I think those two things, just like people can pick up on a copy and pasted email, people can pick up on some of that, the genuine vibes, if you put that out.
Yeah, sure. I think that that's really valuable because you're not trying to make yourself seem like something you're not, right? It's not like,
exactly.
It's not like get in touch with my team and maybe we'll schedule an episode, where you're like,
don't say that. Yeah, don't ever say that.
Like, you're just a guy. I know you're just a guy. What are you doing? But yeah, I mean, I think that, because I've done the same thing with some folks where, I reach out and I know that my platform relative to other options that they have is pretty small, right? I'm like, listen, I'm not going to tell you we have a ton of listeners, probably a few hundred downloads per episode. Some of the folks are pretty dedicated in terms of what they're going to take action on. So I bet some people will actually act on any message that you put out there. But, I'm not going to pretend this is the Joe Rogan experience or something where you're going to sell 1,000 books from 1 hour of your time or whatever, or 3 hours in his case. So I think that's really, and did you do that intuitively, that sort of that reach out process, or is that something that you got guidance on or picked up from someone?
The reaching out process, I think that this dates back to when I was blogging and when I was able to get myself on, blogs that I admired. Like the reach out process was kind of similar in a sense. And so I did have some guidance on that. I went through kind of like an online freelancer type of course where that really is what I used to help get my first couple clients with coaching at that time. And I am somebody who tries to look for parallels within things that are totally unrelated. Like, how can I take what he's saying over here about getting clients and freelancing and take some of those concepts and principles and apply it to my guest outreach? And really that's what I did, was kind of take the bigger picture ideas of showing that like I value their time, being totally honest and genuine and making it very easy for them to respond. So I did have some guidance, but I think it was in a totally like unrelated scenario that I tried to make very related.
Sure. Yeah. Extract the principles and see how they relate. What course was that?
That was the Earn 1K course by Ramit Sethi.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I've just recently been going back through his copywriting course, which is really great. I don't know if you've taken that one, but it's extremely helpful.
Yeah, I really love his material. I've been following it for quite some time. And, that was one of those things where it came to me at just the right time and really set a good foundation, I think, for everything that I'm doing now.
Sure. Yeah, that's very interesting. And let me ask you another more tactical question then, because again, I'm sort of thinking of the person who's like, okay, I kind of like the idea of reaching out to people and starting a podcast or trying to get myself on blogs and all that kind of stuff. Did you just message these people on Instagram? Did you track down an email address? Like literally, what are you doing to even get in contact with them? Because I think that people think of, influencers or people who they see as totally inaccessible. But it's not necessarily as hard as you would think to sort of find their contact information.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Everybody's email for the most part is like public information. You know what I mean? Like you go on a guest that you're interested in, you go on their website. If they have a contact form and no email, you go through the contact form. If they do have an email, you can reach out through that email. I have done a couple through Instagram, but then you also have to keep the context of that platform in mind, right? The attention span isn't really there as much. So if you're DMing somebody, it has to be like just the perfect amount of information for them to say yes or no. Like, hey, can we take this conversation to email? Is this even something you'd be interested in? So I've done that a couple times. It's not... I don't think it's finding...
You don't prefer to slide into their DMs?
I mean, look, I love the DM feature, right? But in terms of like guests that I'm trying to have on the show, not all the time. I've done it a couple times, but I prefer email just because I can have more information there and give them more context as to like what I'm about.
Sure. So I kind of want to circle back to something you were talking about earlier. You mentioned, a back injury kind of being a catalyst for a lot of this, content creation for you and kind of recognizing a different purpose in fitness. What actually happened with your back, and where were you at in your life at the time that you had that injury?
Ooh, okay. So I was teaching a lot of classes. I was doing like 6 or 7 spinning classes a week. I was doing personal training and then a couple boot camp classes as well. And this is around the time that I had first discovered CrossFit. So and as you know, when you're teaching spinning, you're doing boot camps, like you're doing it, right? Like you're actually working out with the class. You're a fitness instructor. You're not really coaching. And so I was doing all of that plus what I was doing when I showed up into the CrossFit gym, right? And it just ended up being too much work. Like I was overtraining, and I didn't really see myself as somebody. I saw myself as a special snowflake, like, I'm fine. That can't happen to me. Like, you know what I mean? The
Sure.
concept of injury just was not really going through my mind at all. And so what happened was, one day I think it was like snatching or something like that. And I clearly remember like, oh my gosh, I'm using my back. This does not really feel right, but I kept doing it anyways. And then, I was fine afterwards, but then it was a Sunday, and later that Sunday, I literally was kind of like wobbling around. Like I felt like I had strained something. So I'm like, okay, I'll just take it easy for the next couple days. And those next couple days turned into like a week or 2 weeks where I was being super cautious. Something didn't feel right. And then I think I remember front squatting. It wasn't even really heavy, but it was like, that was the moment where I was just like, okay, after I put the bar down, I'm like, that did not feel good. And then, really at that point, I ventured out into kind of, finding some professional help, right? Like, I think a chiropractor was my first option, and what he had on his site looked great to me. And so I kind of just got started in that process. And, 3 months had really gone by and I had seen no change in kind of my current situation. I had also received like this, paradigm shifting feedback from him that was like, hey, this is going to take you like not 6 months to recover from, and you shouldn't do anything except walk in water. Like, walk in water or walk. That's it. And to me, like my world came crashing down, right? Because I was a fitness instructor. I had to do all this stuff. And then I wanted to coach. I loved doing CrossFit that I just kind of started. And it just like completely threw a wrench in all of my plans. And then after months had gone by and I had done a little more research that like, hey, there's not just one chiropractor in the area, and like not all chiropractors think alike. And then I kind of found somebody. She was a physical therapist who was a coach herself, and she was very knowledgeable in what she did. And so once I started working with her, within 4 weeks, I was kind of moving again, and the road to recovery was kind of making some progress. But yeah, that was the overall gist of that experience. And it took a good 9 months to a year to kind of get back to where I was. I had herniated a disc in my lower back, and from not really doing anything, during those 3 or 4 months or whatever, that made the situation even worse because it was just like I was so scared to do anything because I had pain, forget working out, like getting out of the car or like vacuuming, like day-to-day activities. I had pain during that, and I was just like, it was a completely new experience for me.
Yeah, got it. So for you then, that kind of forced you to really reevaluate I think that sort of special snowflake story is very relevant for anyone who's probably overtrained themselves or pushed themselves to the point of an injury. I know I experienced something similar, overtraining into oblivion, just sort of neglecting the signals from my body and being like, oh, well, no, I'm fine. I can run a business that I have no control over and not eat any food and train, 2+ hours a day. Like I'm going to be fine. And then, at some point you're just not fine anymore.
Yeah. And I have tremendous empathy, for people who are in that position, or they've just been cleared to start working out again, but they don't know how to bridge back. Like, they're scared to do certain things because of the experience they've had. And now that I'm thinking about it, like, a lot of the individual clients I work with are in that boat where they've been cleared to work out. They're trying to bridge their way back into training in a way that's not too intense, and that's going to progress them back into, living longer, more fulfilling lives, pain-free, and having fun with training again.
Sure. So that injury kind of then, like you said, refocused you into saying, okay, my priority isn't being a maniac and coaching 8 spin classes a day and trying to train for weightlifting. It's to focus on my own health and longevity and communicate in fitness. Is that kind of the tipping point for that?
Yeah, I think you summed that up really well. I would say that, this is in hindsight, right? As I was going through that's not really, I had some of those realizations, but it took months and months and months for that to really all kind of come together. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's not just like you front squat and then you're sad for a day and then you're like, well, my new purpose is like, it's probably not that simple.
Right.
Yeah. Well then, so let me ask you about the process that you kind of go through for guests, right? Because again, kind of researching for this show and going back and listening through to some of the older episodes before I'd even started checking out your podcast compared to the new ones. Definitely the sort of arc of your interviewing has gotten just dramatically better, right? Where initially it was a lot of like, okay, cool, here's just like some rapid fire questions, like, cool, man, thanks for the time, whatever. Whereas now you're much better about getting an actual story out of the guests and kind of having it be more of like a two-way conversation. How do you actually think about that and structure it? Because I know for me, it's kind of a challenging process to keep the conversation on track and try to ask questions that are interesting and make sure that there's, interesting stories and development that's going on throughout. What are you thinking about as you go through that process?
Well, it's definitely, like you said, it's evolved over time, and something that I really believe dearly in is like what I'm doing on podcasts. I try not to think of them as interviews because I'm not a journalist. I'm not like a broadcaster. I think of just myself as like a conversationalist. And I really admire Joe Rogan's podcasting style where it's so free flowing. It's like with certain guests, he can be totally in that interviewer mode where he's just curious and he's asking questions that we also want to know the answers to. But then in other episodes with comedians and stuff, he can just be messing around and having fun. And I'm having a great time as a listener being entertained by that. So to me, he's one of the biggest like inspirations in terms of how I try to, conduct my show. And really the process for researching for a guest comes down to like, okay, what work do they already kind of have out there? I'll just kind of browse around there. If they have podcasts out already, I'll listen to some of them, and that usually brings up more questions for me, and I'll kind of create a long list of questions. And then over time, what I'll do is just kind of refine that a bit. So when it comes time to actually sitting down and interviewing the person or having that conversation with them, it's like a lot of what I had written down doesn't even kind of make the show. It's just to kind of get my own curiosity going. And then I really have tried to work on and refine my skills in a way that when I'm when I'm actually in the moment and having that conversation with somebody, I'm better at going with what's in that moment, not just relying on the questions that I have. And that, I think, is a skill in and of itself, something that I definitely took me a very long time to develop. And I still am nowhere near like what I think my potential is with that. But that's the idea for me is like, somebody like Larry King, he's inspirational to me as well, but he never prepares for any pod. He doesn't, not for a podcast, but any interview. He wants to totally have no idea who the other person is. And so he is totally curious and totally present when he's sitting down with that person. Now, I'm not that extreme where like I just don't prep at all, but it's like I try to maintain that type of curiosity so that when I sit down with somebody, like I have the ability to free flow and kind of go with what's in the moment.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a tough balance to understand, how to trust your intuition. I mean, you mentioned Larry King as someone who has built just a massive career on having a crazy intuition and being able to trust it versus having the sort of structure to fall back on so that you kind of know which direction you're going in. Something else that I wonder is, how do you balance what you actually want to know versus what your theoretical audience wants to know, right? I mean, are you trying to cater to people as you ask questions, or are you trying to think, well, this is the stuff that's important to me that I want to hear from this person?
That's a great question, because early on, I would have told you that I really try to go with what the audience wants to know. And I would think about questions and topics, and also even some of my guests would be dictated by what my audience would be interested in. But over time, it's gotten to this point where I really just chase my curiosity and hope that people who are listening find that interesting. Of course, along the way, like if I see an opportunity to ask a question around something tactical that the audience might like and walk away with, I'll take it and I'll do it. There's no like set formula for that, though. I think it really starts with me being curious and what I want to know in that conversation, and put myself into kind of this beginner's mind. And then everything else kind of stems from that. Like it's more intuitive than a set formula. And it's evolved over time. It comes with practice. When you first start out doing like podcasting or having these conversations that are public, you're going to be like, what? This sounds impossible. Like when I heard Larry King talk about that in the very beginning, like I was just, there's no way I could have done that. I would have froze. I would have been in my head in like, like, oh, what do I ask next? I ran out of questions. Like I just would have totally broken down. It's something that comes the more that you do it. Like with experience, it gets easier and easier.
Sure. Yeah. I'm just imagining the classic Chris Farley SNL thing, right? Where you're in front of someone, you're freaking out. You're like, so remember the time when you took second at the CrossFit Games?
Yeah.
What about the time you won the CrossFit Games? Do you remember that?
Yeah, dude. I mean, it's an evolution that kind of has to happen. Like CTP, right? Something that he says a lot is you got to get the reps in. And because the first few attempts are always going to be shitty in whatever it is that you kind of attack. So you have to get that out of the way. You got to go through those growing pains before you get to a point where there's this level of comfort and fluidity in whatever it is you're doing.
Sure. And something that I find really interesting is the concept of storytelling and creating stories through, I mean, in this case, conversations, right? So storytelling is definitely not something that comes naturally to me. I mean, I'm definitely a extremely systematic, non-emotional person where I'm like, well, who cares? Like, tell me the facts. Like, I'll read a scientific paper on it. I don't care about the emotion and the feelings and the sort of like classic narrative that goes with it. But I think that's also just like not true, even though I say that, that every human being does respond to stories. So for me, it's been a real challenge to think through concepts in terms of stories rather than just, abstraction and facts and science. So how do you think through your conversations as stories, and how do you get your guests to communicate in a way that will be resonant with other people?
Well, first, let me just say I'm 100% with you on that. I love storytelling to the point where I've done things like taking an improv comedy class to experience and learn more about that. And I've read the works of like Christopher Vogler, Joseph Campbell, talking about the hero's journey. Like any chance I can get to learn more about storytelling, I will, because it's just something that doesn't come naturally to me, just like you mentioned. And any experience I have with that so far is just like, it's taken so much work to get there, and it's still like a work in progress. I'm still improving at it. But how I think about kind of taking people through a story structure, it's kind of loose, but it's in 3 parts. So it's like when the guest comes on, I like to establish some context, what is their backstory, that gives us a vested interest in their journey, right? Like what is it about them that I can share with the listeners? What can I bring out that maybe they haven't shared with other people before? Just setting some context and background, right? Creating the character. Character is everything. And then from that point, it's like once we've established that, then we can get into some tactical pieces. Like if the episode is revolving program design, then we can get into program design and things like that. And then I always love to end with also bringing more of their personality out and sharing their story. And that happens a lot of times through rapid fire questions, right? Is like, you never know what type of story that this one question might elicit. So really it's about personality, and I would say creating a character, right? Because the hero's journey is something that we all resonate with and that we all go through. And it's one of those things, if you want to get better at storytelling, I would recommend just learning more about kind of the basics of what the hero's journey really consists of, and loosely understand it so that, you know, you're just more aware of it when you're thinking about how you talk about your own life and how you listen to other people. It's everywhere.
So you're basically thinking about creating the guest as a character and then allowing them to sort of offer, you know, their own hero's journey, and then balance that with enough tactical information and knowledge so that people can get actionable items to take away.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
here's a good point, right?
Way to look at it.
Well, sometimes forget like an actionable piece of information. Sometimes the story itself is so powerful that it inspires action within the person who's listening, right? So I'm a big fan of entertainment, and that education wrapped in entertainment is like 10 times more effective. So for me, it's always about the story and the character. And even if I go through a whole episode, like without giving a purely like, hey, these are the 3 steps to doing X, but I can get a good story out of that person, and that's really what that episode was about. Like, I'm fulfilled with that conversation, because to me, it's super powerful to think about it like that. And I'm hoping I attract the people who will also pick up on that as well.
Yeah, sure. That's a great framework for thinking about it, because I think that's always super challenging to balance all these different ideas and not just get lost in some abstract theory that no one can learn anything from, to not get bogged down into the details so much that you're, you know, talking reps and sets and program design and everyone is zoned out other than the one super nerd who cares about that. And really finding a way to make this information resonate with people. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So let me ask you about the balance between having yourself as sort of like a host, right? Who's almost like we talked about, sort of a vehicle for your audience to be part of a conversation, right? It's an option for them to be potentially a fly on a wall for a conversation that they'd like to be part of, or to have questions asked that they want to know the answer to, or to sort of follow along with your journey of learning, right? And balancing that with actually being something of an expert yourself, right? Because I mean, you have your own program design clients, you have your own online content and courses surrounding questions and you know, rehab from injuries and all that kind of stuff. So how do you find that balance where you're not necessarily positioning yourself as an expert when you are interviewing people, but you are an expert in a lot of your professions?
That's really interesting, because it's something I thought about very early on a lot, and it's something I don't think about much anymore at all. Like, I let go of it at some point. And I actually got to a point where I had this guest on who was also a podcaster, and at the end of the conversation, I asked, hey, like, what do you think I could have done kind of better in? Like, where can I improve, right? And the answer he gave me was that I should share more of my own story to get the audience to kind of know me a little bit better. And up until that point, I mean, that was a big struggle. Like, I could ask the questions, but I had a tough time like sharing things about myself without it being too much, you know? And then me 2 minutes later being like, wow, I just went on a 2-minute rant about like, you know, something that happened to me like 2 years ago. Is it really interesting to people? But I've gotten more comfortable with that the more I've been able to practice it. And the more I think of this as just a conversation versus an interview. It's helped, and I don't know if people can pick up on it, but from episode to episode, you can hear me sharing more and more and getting more comfortable with that. So that's one way, is share parts of your story, because over time, and that's the thing, is like, podcasting is such a long game. It's not something that in 10 episodes or 20 episodes, like, you're going to be known as the expert. I feel like it takes time of you doing that consistently. And then once you've got, like, I don't know, 30, 50, 100, whatever episodes kind of in the bank, at a certain point, hopefully people are coming to listen to your show because it's your show and not just the guest that's on, because that's what happens a lot of times, and how you get new listeners is, like, people are coming to listen to whoever the guest is, but you want to get to a point where they find your perspective interesting enough that they're going to come to listen to you. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think it does. Cause I mean, I also think the point you're talking about with sort of using, guests as a vehicle to attract listeners, but then sort of winning them over time. I mean, yeah, that's definitely a long game, right? Where someone is going to come check out the Airborne Mind because they saw the functional bodybuilding hashtag on Instagram and then started following this freakish godlike being doing weird kettlebell exercises. And then they somehow stumble across a podcast that he's on. And they're like, oh, well, I guess there's like 5 interviews with this guy, so maybe I'll check out this other one, right? And then based upon that, there's going to start to be like, oh, okay, like this guy's actually pretty interesting. Maybe I want to hear what he has to say, even if I don't know the guest.
Exactly. And that leads me into the next part of what that guest told me was, maybe you should start blogging more, or doing solo episodes where you were kind of sharing your perspective a little bit more. And that was just an idea he gave me. And at that point, I realized, okay, Instagram is something that I've been messing around with, and I've been, I could get more serious with it. I have some traction. Like, why not just do that on Instagram? So like, if you follow on Instagram at Airborne Mind, there's a lot of workout videos and a lot of things related to program design or functional bodybuilding and things of that nature. And that was kind of the platform that I used to just kind of share more, where it was just me. I did try a couple solo episodes. It just got to be too much, but it's something that I'd love to pick back up on because I love doing it. So yeah, don't put all your eggs in one basket, I would say. Like, don't just rely on podcasting to do that for you if that's something you're aiming for. Make sure you have kind of other channels that you're pursuing at the same time, because the other thing that also does is it takes away this neediness is the wrong word, but this framework in your mind that's like, oh, I need to be viewed as an expert through these episodes, like I that's kind of like your desire. Whereas if you have other things you're working on, it's like you just don't think about it as much because you're so busy doing the work and kind of in that action mode and creating that you don't have time to pause and be like, oh, am I being viewed as an expert? Like, are people perceiving this the right way? So I would say, yeah, just kind of make sure that you have multiple options. Not too many though, but like have 2 or 3 that really work for you.
Sure. So essentially the different channels that you utilize, you can put different forms of content out there on that may have a slightly different tone. And actually, let me clarify something, because I think that I sort of used the term expert in a way that I didn't necessarily mean to. Actually, circling back to Ramit Sethi, I went to a workshop where one of his copywriters was speaking, and he was talking about online marketing and positioning, and that, if you're sort of building a quote unquote personal brand, which is just like the most disgusting term, but I suppose that functions for what we're talking about. That the sort of 3 frameworks that he was recommending were either the expert, the good friend, or the convert, right? And just sort of like classic examples of each. Let's say the expert is someone who's like, okay, cool. Like, here's my system. Here's how we're going to get it done. We're going to do A, B, C, D. We're going to assess you on this. Then based upon that result, we're going to give you E, F, G. You're going to follow these bullet points and you're going to get results, right? So if you look at something like, say, OPEX, right? James Fitzgerald is an expert in that sense, where based upon his accomplishments and the way he speaks about things, it's like, cool. If you want answers in fitness, like, this is a guy to go to. He's going to tell you what to do. And if you look at something like the good friend, that's more like, let's say, Oprah, where it's like, hey, are you a middle-aged lady who has struggled historically with your weight and has a bunch of like sketchy, like kind of weird pseudoscientific beliefs? Like, me too. Let me take you on this journey with me as I talk to Tony Robbins and Deepak Chopra and, Brene Brown. And I'm essentially a vehicle for you to hear what you want to hear, because I'm basically the same as you. I just have a lot of money and a lot of connections you don't have.
Yeah.
Which, and the third one is the convert. So I think that the example you used was, say, James Altucher, which is like, I've made millions of dollars. I lost it all. Here's what I learned in that process. Here's what I learned remaking that money. Let me show you what I did. Here's my experience. So it's not, here's my system. Like, I've worked with thousands of clients. Check out my bullet points. It's, here's my personal story. Maybe you'll resonate with that as well. So I think the, my question was more just balancing for you, right? The fact that in some areas of what you're doing, you're the expert, you're the coach, you're the one who people are coming to like, hey man, like, write my exercise program for me. Tell me what to do. Whereas in other aspects, you're more like the, the good friend where it's like, hey, cool. Like, this guy gets to hang out with people who go to the CrossFit games and kind of ask them questions that I want to know.
Yeah. It's funny because I don't always see myself that way. Like, you're right. There are people that come up to me and ask me about program design or about podcasting and things like that. And maybe in their perspective, like, I'm the expert, but to me, like, in my own head, I'm just trying to kind of portray what things are like sometimes. I got asked a really good question the other day. It was like, what areas do you consider yourself a teacher in, but also a student of? And I was like, whoa, that's podcasting, that's communication, that's program design. That's like, I can be a teacher, but at the same time, like, on the other end, I'm still a student. And the more that the more that I feel like I know and that I'm learning, it's like the more I really don't know. And that is what kind of keeps pushing like that growth curve. And as long as you keep following that, it's like, I mean, it happens. Like, people will pick up on the fact that, like, or they'll tell you if they think that you're an expert. I've never, like, I think, resorted to myself or calling myself as an expert. It's something that, it's something over time. I think with consistency and with patience, it'll come if you keep chasing your curiosity and pushing the craft, whatever that might be.
Yeah, sure. I think that makes sense. With your own, I mean, I guess just your ideas surrounding sharing more of yourself. I mean, you mentioned that was challenging for you. I mean, what's the story there? Is that something that, you were uncomfortable being vulnerable, or you just didn't feel like you had anything to say? What did you go through in order to start sharing more of your own stories?
Well, I would say it's a bit of both. Yeah. Like, being vulnerable, but then it's like, okay, well, how much vulnerability is too much, right? Like, am I oversharing here? Just kind of being in my own head about that. And then, like, not really knowing what to say, like, well, which parts of my story do I really share, and this, okay, I'll tell you, like, what has been probably the most effective thing for me. I would say right around the time that I got to Invictus, like, 6 months ago, maybe, I had started, working with a therapist, and it was one of the best decisions I've ever made. I had this choice at that time. I was like, you know what? I can either invest in like a business coach, a life coach, or like some form of mentorship, some form of coaching. And I had looked around at a couple different options, and I had realized that, you know what? I think that therapy would be like the best option for me to learn more about myself so that I can effectively communicate to other people. I mean, it's helped in terms of like healing for me in a lot of different ways, but it's made me better at being more self-aware and being able to share the parts, that are relevant and that I want in a more clear and effective way. And I'm not sure if that is the experience with everybody who goes through, therapy, but it's like, the one that I found that I really connected with, it's been a great relationship that's worked so well so far. And so I keep rolling with it. Like, I just, even though I may not quote unquote like need it, it's like, it's something that's helping me learn more and more. And I'm getting better at being able to share with other people.
Sure. And do you remember any specific moments where you're like, okay, I'm going to try to share this thing that went wrong for you in the past?
That's a good question. A specific thing that went wrong for me, nothing like there's not like a huge moment that sticks out to me, although I'm sure I may have over time at some point, whether that was a blog post or Instagram or whatever. But really, in small ways, maybe like the first example that comes to mind is, when I was talking to Marcus Philly on the latest episode, right? And being totally like open about the fact that like, my conditioning sucks. Like, it's an area I've sucked at for a very long time. And like being able to joke about that and roll with it, like in the past, there may have been a part of me that was like, you know what, maybe I shouldn't say that, maybe I should, like, maybe that will take away from my credibility that I'm not good at this CrossFit thing, or that I'm not like, I don't have a good engine. Right. But being that was a small shift that I can now look back on. I'm like, you know what, like I was totally comfortable sharing that. And I feel like there's many of those moments that happen from episode to episode. But there's no like one huge one that's kind of coming to me right now.
Yeah, sure. So it's more just, you'll have an idea of what you might want to say, and then that filter just isn't quite as strong in terms of like, oh, don't say this, you'll look stupid. Don't say this, you'll look dumb. Don't say this, you'll look like you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Like that filter used to be really huge, like I'd be really careful about like what I want to say, and really like judging myself hard. But over time that's gotten easier and easier and easier. And it's that filter has shrunk, where it's like, that still may happen for me, and it comes back from time to time, but it's definitely not as strong, and it doesn't happen as often.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that at least sort of empirically, anecdotally, all that kind of stuff, that people who have that really strong filter are so concerned with not being the kind of like boorish loudmouth person who just says whatever they want, that they're like, well, I can't be like that person who's super obnoxious and everyone hates, so I will say nothing ever. And it's like, yeah, and I'm kind of like that too, where it's like, well, I'm probably already so far on the end of the spectrum of like not speaking up or not saying what I think or not sharing about myself, that I'm so far from being the person who's going to, overwhelm someone with bizarre personal details, that I don't need to be as concerned about it as I think I do.
Yeah, it starts with a lot of asking yourself questions. That's something I can think of that I've done, and I still do, is like when I'm journaling and writing, like frame certain questions to yourself. Like, if just that example you gave where you're looking at somebody who shares a lot and is obnoxious or whatever, like ask yourself why, what is it about that makes you feel that they're obnoxious, right? Whether that's right or wrong, it's like dig into that type of stuff and keep going down that rabbit hole, because you end up finding something that's super interesting, and you might have some light bulb moments that go off for yourself. That'll help you in that process and being able to share.
Yeah, sure. I think I actually just wrote a little email blast about personality types and all that kind of stuff. And sort of on that topic, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I was talking about when people just say something totally wrong, and then they're like, well, I was just making conversation. And to someone like me, I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, what does it even mean to make conversation? Why to you is it appropriate to just say like uneducated, wrong stuff? Like, being correct is way more important than conversation, right? And that's not necessarily like a helpful thought pattern, but that's my immediate intuitive response. And for other people, that's just not the way they see the world. That's not what they value. They're like, well, I just wanted to say something, like bounce ideas off of you, and like, just have it's a conversation. What's wrong with you? And I'm like, well, it's wrong, so say the right thing.
Yeah, it's like digging into that, and I can think of something that's been helpful for me that your audience might also find use in is Cheryl Strayed. In Tools of Titans, there's a section in that book from Cheryl Strayed that's like 17 writing prompts or something like that, right? And you don't have to do all of them, but take a glance at it and roll with just one of those prompts or one of those questions if you can't come up with one yourself right off the bat, and just see what happens. Take some time, sit down, write it out, and see what comes up for you. And over time, like, everybody's got a story. You know what I mean? It's like we just have to learn how to tell it.
Sure. Yeah. And people don't necessarily realize that their own story is pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, I think even for you, where it's like, okay, here's some guy in Philadelphia who was coaching too many spin classes and hurt his back, and now is coaching for one of the fittest people on earth, and sort of facilitate all that through a podcast and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's a pretty great story, right?
Right. But in my mind, right, like there's times where I doubt
like,
that.
yeah, it's just what I do.
It's just what I do. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's not as interesting as some of the other stories that I'm thinking of. Like that comparison thing happens. Right. So it's really about, and it's ironic because when I'm having these consults with my own clients, like I am just as fascinated with their stories as I am with any guest that comes on the show. It's like that transfers over for me. So it really is a matter of learning more and more about yourself in a way that allows you to share and communicate that better to other people, because chances are that like we're all human, and a lot of what resonates with you and struggles that you've been through, like people can connect with that and people will resonate with that. It's just, it is an art and it's a skill in and of itself to be able to tell stories. That's why movies are so fascinating to watch. And that's why actors get paid millions of dollars because there's this compelling story that we are drawn to. And the same goes for podcasting or any other piece of art. Is like storytelling is the heart of it all. And it's something that if you want to get better at, like there's got to be some action steps that you need to take towards improving it.
So let's keep going with your story, since I think we sort of left you at Invictus and we've touched on it a few times, but now you're coaching with Revival Strength, working with Marcus Philly, doing remote coaching and individual program design for people. I think you guys have more on-site clients now as well. How did that come to pass? What did that look like for you?
How did I get to Revival Strength?
Yeah.
So pretty much, halfway during my stay at Invictus, I made a trip out to San Rafael to do a podcast with Marcus and kind of just film some videos with him. And this was like maybe the third or fourth time that he had been on the show, and we had hit it off really well from the first time that he was on. So we got along really well. We got to finally meet in person. Like that trip was very well worth it for me. And we just started talking around, like his vision around what he wanted the gym to look like. And it resonated with me. The whole process of individual design, like this, it was something that I was working towards this entire time, was like individualized coaching and remote coaching. And he had mentioned that he was looking for a coach. And to me, these light bulbs kind of went off, and I didn't say anything right away. But before
I'm a coach,
before he left that day, I was like, you know what? Because at the same time, I had these opportunities that were coming my way, like a couple different opportunities that I figured would be like, they're great, but it was a pivotal point for me to decide where I was going to go. Like, am I going to take this job or this job? And then also, how does that impact Airborne Mind and what I want that to look like? I was also feeling lost with that at this point. So I asked him, I'm like, hey, could I like kind of just give you some of where I'm at with Airborne Mind and just get some advice from you, and just kind of get your thoughts from just an outside perspective as to what my next steps should be based on like my goals. And he was like, yeah, of course, man. And literally like the next morning, super early, we had this conversation, and we were on the phone, and I must have gone on for like 15 minutes straight of just explaining like way too much detail, but like giving him the entire lowdown, being a completely open book. And then the process kind of started from there, where it was like, all right, let's kind of map out what it would look like if you were to coach here. And things very fluidly kind of happened from that point. Once I made the decision that like, this is what I want to do, this is where I want to go. There's a lot of obstacles that came in my way during that point, but it was like everything happened seamlessly once that decision was made.
Sure. So just kind of a smooth, organic process of being in the right place at the right time, and being a guy who's asking good questions, and having, I guess, transparency surrounding where you're at and what your goals are. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And really it was all of the little moments, like add up to, it's not like this just happened, right? It's like there's so much behind the scenes, that small things that added up to get me to a certain point where I was there in that moment. And, this previous history was there where I'd had him on the show before, and, where I was at, like all these things come together. We can't really pinpoint it on just one or two things. And our human brains want to do that, right? Like, oh, what was that one thing that led to this happening? It's like there wasn't one thing. There were like 20 different things that just added up, and it all happened, like you said, at the right time, at the right moment.
Yeah, sure. So you are coaching now, folks. What does that process look like? How does that work?
So pretty much individual design is about, having one client, one coach, taking lifestyle factors into consideration, and each individual getting a uniquely customized nutrition prescription and training prescription based on where they're at today. So there's this like assessment process that happens. There's consultations that happen, every 4 weeks, and then prescription happens. And it's like we kind of revisit those three things in a circle over and over throughout the course of however long these clients are with us. And the beautiful thing is, like, everybody's got an individualized program, but everybody's able to do it together, and that community aspect is still preserved. So it's like you have Marcus Philly doing his programming, who's coached by Mike Lee. He's doing it out on the floor. I'm next to him, doing my program that he's written for me. And then next to me is this guy, Guyan, who's like in his 60s, and he's doing like glute bridges and static holds, and like we're all doing it together. So that to me is like a beautiful aspect of individual design. And yeah, like remote coaching is really like the bulk of, the business here at Revival Strength and my clients, my personal clients. But on-site coaching is something we're really pushing towards right now, and trying to have more people with us on the floor that we can watch reps in person and kind of interact and engage in a way that you may not be able to in a remote setting.
Yeah, sure. And for your coaching process, I mean, is that something that you've been essentially developing since your days in Philadelphia, or is that something that you've kind of worked with Marcus? I mean, how are you progressing as a coach?
I would say it feels like accelerated growth, because you're right. The process for developing myself as a coach started all the way from that personal training kind of scenario, right? And then getting into group fitness and honing the craft there, then getting to Invictus, honing the craft, getting feedback there. And then now being in this individualized setting, it's like the information that I'm learning through CCP, OPEC CCP, their educational content, plus guidance from Marcus. So, and then plus me actually implementing it and using it with clients. It's like this circle of feedback that's happening all the time. Like I'll go to Marcus all the time with questions around like, hey, did I do this the right way? How should I approach this person's program or nutrition? And then Marcus is really invested in coaching development. It's something that I myself was surprised by, and I'm still surprised by like how committed he is to that. Like 2 times a week, we all coaches sit together for 2 hours, and we have these like meetings where we discuss like case studies and assessments and ways to elevate our coaching, ways to elevate how we talk about our coaching, and really all the tools that we need to grow as coaches. Any obstacles we're facing, it's like there's space for that in a weekly setting, and it's a lot. It's like 3-4 hours in a week that's dedicated specifically to improving what we're bringing to the table to our clients.
Yeah, I mean, that's really impressive to carve out that time to really focus, I mean, like you mentioned, on the craft. And what do those sessions look like? I mean, you mentioned case studies and all that kind of stuff, but I mean, that's a lot of time. What are you guys actually doing to improve the process you're taking your clients through?
Well, a lot of it, I would say case studies is a big part, where we may, one person might have to share, a certain client that they just put through assessments. And really what that is, let's say it's me, I'm walking people through my thought process of why I did what I did. And when you have 4 other coaches who are in the room, Marcus Philly included, like there's feedback that happens there. Oh, well, why'd you do that? And then it's like, maybe I didn't have a good answer for it. Maybe I could have done something a little bit better. And so that is learning in and of itself. Then there's other times where, he might be like, all right, let's sit down. We're going to take 5 minutes here. You guys are going to write a 6-week progression for single leg work for a client who is like a level 1 client, who their assessment looked like X and Y. And then we have to share it. Everybody gets to share kind of their perspective on what they did. And there's no like judgment. There's no right or wrong all the time. It's just like this feedback process that happens. And I always at least walk away from those meetings feeling like, man, my brain was just like stretched and like there's growth that just happened there, you know?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So Misbah, you have to go do another podcast shortly, such as the life of a podcasting man. Two in one day, man. That's pretty aggressive. I know Rogan will say that. He's like, yo, we got another one coming up. I'm like, dude, that sounds terrible. You just did a 3.5 hour long podcast. How can you possibly do this again? But I guess that's what the dedication to the craft is. So you've got a lot of stuff going on. You have your own show, the Airborne Mind, which is great. This is kind of a tough question, but if you had to pick 2 episodes for people to listen to off the top of your head, so no one could get mad at you, which 2 would those be?
Ooh, wow.
Well, you can't even look. It's just off the top of your head. It's impulsive, so no one's mad because it's just kind of like a question I didn't even prep you for.
Got it. Okay, so I would say the latest episode with Marcus Philly, and then maybe James Fitzgerald, the latest episode with him, because we were able to get kind of really personal and in his head. And I'm not sure if he's shared that perspective on other shows that he's been on. So that was really special to me that we were able to kind of go in that direction versus like traditional program design and educational material.
Sure. Awesome. So 2 episodes that are good. There's many more that are also good. So, I always get excited and upset when I get into a podcast because it's like, cool, this is awesome. Now I know I'm going to go back into the archives like a psycho and stress myself out by trying to listen to too many of them. You also have your own coaching that we just talked about. If someone wants coaching, is interested in working with Revival Strength, what do they do?
Head over to revival-strength.com. I'm assuming remote coaching. If you're in San Rafael, definitely stop by here on site, but hit train with us, individual coaching. Take a look at the process and see if it's something that sits well with you. And if it does, the contact form is below. Just make sure you hit who would you like to work with, Misbah, and just fill out the rest of the information there.
That's right. Who would you like to work with? The answer is Misbah. Then the other thing that I know you have going on, we actually spent a lot of this podcast talking about this, is you have an online course that you're starting to offer on your site about questions and how to utilize them to create connection. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, so myself and a clinical psychologist who we both are super passionate about the art of communication, but we're from 2 completely different fields. She has spent years and years studying this stuff and applying it in, a setting with her own clients. And I've worked on communication really as far as back as I can remember, and I've applied it to coaching and podcasting. And so we try to distill some of this information down into like, what is the first series or first chapter that we can give coaches or gym owners, these tools that we can give them to conduct better consultations and build deeper relationships with their existing clients. So whether you're in a one-on-one setting or group setting, I think as a coach, like, it's massively helpful to be armed with ways to build deeper and more fulfilling relationships, because it's the base of everything. Without a foundational good relationship, like nutrition prescriptions and program design, like none of that really matters if that relationship isn't strong. And as coaches, we know that like even referrals and retention and all those things that we want comes back to having strong, fulfilling relationships and being able to improve your communication. So yeah, we're looking to hopefully go live like around Christmas time or before the end of the year. So if you want more information on that, you can check that out at theairbornemind.com.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think that the X's and O's and the reps and sets on the whiteboard, that's the easy part, right? The hard part is getting people to actually buy in and execute and provide feedback and adjust over time. It's not so hard to be like, oh, rear foot elevated split squat, here's the tempo. We'll load it with a kettlebell this week. We'll do a dumbbell this week. That's the easy stuff. It's much harder to get people, like you said, to really understand what they're doing and why they're doing it.
100%. I think this is something that James said on the show, where he was like, the prescription is science, right? But the art is really the coaching and the communication, the behavioral change, and all that type of stuff that happens, side to side with that.
Great. Well, Misbah, I know you got to talk to Calvin's son, so thanks for hanging out, man.
Absolutely, man. Once again, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. It was fun being on the other side here. And if you ever have any questions, or if I can ever help anybody in any way, don't hesitate to reach out.
Hey, this is Todd again, and as most of you know, I consume, read, listen to, watch an absurd amount of content on a regular basis, and a few times per month I send out my thoughts on some of the most interesting or insightful stuff that I've taken a look at. You can be on the list to receive this fascinating, captivating, and delightful information at toddneef.com. That's I before E. Head over there, go ahead and type your email address in, and then as I send these things out, again, a few times a month, you'll get it and you'll be inundated with a carefully curated list of the best stuff that I am experiencing.